So let me tell you what we're going to do today. I'm going to start by giving you 10 tips about writing that I have found to be helpful over the years. And I'll talk to you about those in a minute. So I'm going to go through those 10 tips, and then I'm going to try and illustrate some of what I'm telling you by reading you 3 different passages from my own work. Several of them are from this book, Back to School, that we'll be raffling off at the end of the session. And then those of you who get the book, I'll be glad to stick around and sign it for you, meet you, and inscribe it. So that's our plan. Let me talk to you just a few minutes about these tips that I'm going to give you. Now, I'm going to be talking about writing about school, but the principles that I'm going to give you, I think, are relevant to a lot of different institutional settings, to libraries, to the criminal justice system, or to other large venues and events, from a whole range of public events, from sporting events to political rallies. So I think you'll find these principles applicable. And then the last thing I want to say is that they veer toward the qualitative, because that tends to be the kind of work I do. But you'll also find in them, I think, a little bit of wisdom about doing quantitative work as well. And I'll indicate that as I'm reading through them. So that's my preface to these 10 tips that I'm going to tell you about, starting right now. So for me to write about education is to write about the human condition. It means that you're writing about people learning and growing, or running up against their limits, or being thwarted by forces and events beyond their control. The writing then is about possibility, about challenge, about disappointment, about failure, about meaning, about identity. And also to write about education for me is to write about institutions and institutional behavior, traditions and bureaucracy and battles over turf, and the way that savvy teachers and administrators and counselors learn to navigate all that. And the institutional wisdom they display in itself makes for quite a story. And to write about education for me is also to write about social attitudes and beliefs, because schools are very porous institutions, and what is outside the walls of the schools manifests itself within the walls of the school. And to write about education is to write about politics and economics, because both affect schools profoundly, as you know. And then finally, to write about education is to write about a society's vision of itself, who we are as a people. And this takes us into history, and that history is replete with injustice and violations of ideals, but also with the realization of democracy and human potential. And it's this scope and sweep, from the details of a classroom to big questions about national vision, that helps explain the power and pleasure for me about writing about education. Now, as David suggested to you in that little bio, I've taught and studied writing for over 40 years. And so in putting together these tips for you, I've thought back over my own writing and also all the writing I've enjoyed during my time in education. And I've tried to condense my advice down to 10 tips, 10 observations that I'm going to offer to you. And I should note one last thing. I'm talking not only about the writing itself here, but that everything that precedes the writing, the thinking and observing and analyzing that goes into the creation of good writing. So I'm going to be talking about that as well as the writing itself. So with that, let's get on to these 10 tips of mine. These are my little bits of wisdom for you. The first thing is to pay attention to the obvious. Now, in terms of school, we've all spent so many years in school that it's hard for us to get any distance from it, to see it new or fresh, as anthropologists like to say, to quote, make it strange. But paradoxically, one way to make school or other institutions we're familiar with, one way to make them strange is just to record the obvious. So you write down or you sketch or you take pictures of the most humdrum everyday things. What surrounds a campus? Describe people entering the campus on foot or on bicycles, in cars. How are desks arranged in a classroom? A place like this. Sketch it out if you can. What kinds of questions does the teacher ask? And how do students respond? How do students interact with each other? And what does the teacher do, just physically? Where does she stand? Does she move through the room? What are her gestures? Try and capture all that seemingly simple stuff. Now, my statistician colleague at UCLA, Mike Seltzer, tells his students to do something similar before applying all their heavy technical statistical machinery to data. He says, look closely at plots of data. Just examine it, see what it looks like on paper. Look at the outliers. Summarize for yourself in plain language what you see. This is Mike's suggestion about numerical data. Now, this kind of everyday material becomes really useful when you're trying to set a scene or to explain context. And sometimes the mundane, the everyday, contains revelations. And I'll give you an example. I was spending a lot of time at a local community college that serves a quite poor section of this city. And I suddenly began to notice how many people walk with some sort of a limp. Now, I was at the college to study barriers to achievement, and this emerging observation of mine about people's gait seemed to me to speak volumes about trauma and the availability of health care. So pay attention to the obvious. Pay attention to the everyday. Tip number 2, the value of detail. Whenever I go into a place, whenever I go into a new setting that I'm going to do any work on, I try to open up all my sensory antennae. What's this? Do I pick up the sharp, biting smell of electrical heat in the factory? Or the little bleats and blasts of musical instruments coming from the music room of a school? Or the creak of old wooden floors? Or the feeling of being jostled in a packed hallway when classes are letting out? The beat writer Jack Kerouac once wrote that, quote, detail is the life of literature. And I think detail is the life of all writing. But here's the thing about detail. You can get lost in details, whether they're verbal images or a slew of statistical correlations. So the details, they need to be there, but they need to lead to an idea. They got to do something. So the idea emerges from the detail you give, and the detail grounds the idea. And we'll see some examples of that in a bit when I do a reading of some of my stuff here. Tip number 3, real speech. So we put a lot of stock in social sciences, in the formal interview or the focus group, and we should. Those are really important sources of information. But I prefer, when it's possible, to talk to people when they're actually doing something related to the topic of the interview. So, for example, I prefer to talk to the student nurse while she's practicing on a mannequin her technique for inserting an IV. Or I like to talk with the teacher as soon as the class is over. Because this way, you're in the flow of their activity. And what they say is going to be more grounded. It's going to be less of an abstraction. I also believe in keeping your ears open all the time. On the bus, on the street, when you're walking across a campus. Never be without a small notepad. Attune your ears to the rhythms of speech, to the staccato give and take in a diner, or to the fragments of a cell phone conversation. Because sometimes the most casual conversation even little bits of overheard speech, will present a phrase or a sentence that captures perfectly the issues you're writing about. And I'll give you an example. I was walking with a student at that community college I was telling you about. I was walking with a student to the bus, just sort of shooting the breeze and walking along, accompanying her as she walked to the bus stop. And out of the blue, she said, you know, it's a terrible thing to not have any money. And I thought, my God, that captures so much. Number 4, tip number 4. A story needs to do something. A story needs to do something. And we tell a lot of stories in social science. It's one of the things that we do and we do well. Now, if you think about it, many of the stories that people tell in everyday life, they have a moral to them. The story is doing something. It's a point that somebody wants to make by telling you the story. Here's the basic plot line of the story. If you think about it, you'll recognize this. Basic plot line is something like this. Look, if you act this way, if you do something that's this foolish or this brave or this considerate, then this is what's going to happen. Stories tend to have that structure, right? That's the plot line. And I think that a story in the writing that we produce likewise has to do something. It needs to contain or build toward a claim or an argument of some kind. Because we're basically saying to our readers, we're saying, look, I'm going to tell you this story because I want to illustrate a point, or I want to shine a new kind of light on something, or I want to reveal layers and tensions where we thought that none existed. So no matter how moving a story might be in itself, it has work to do. Number 5, tip number 5. Numbers can also tell a story. For those of you doing quantitative kinds of work, numbers also tell a story. When I'm working with my students who are quantitative researchers, I ask them what story the numbers tell. That is, I want them to think about numbers narratively. Because even a list or a table can tell a story. And what is that story? What's the story you're trying to tell? And are you mindful of how you're telling that story to a reader? And as your potential reader changes, let's say from one of your colleagues who shares a lot of your knowledge, let's say as your audience changes from that kind of person to a legislator or an administrator or the general public, then how are you going to change the way you tell that story with numbers? Point number 6, using personal stories. A lot of us these days use personal material in their writing, and I certainly do. The stories I use might come from the teaching I've done, or from my experience working in education, or the research I've done. But even closer to home sometimes, the stories can come from my own past or my family. As David told you, I'm the son of Italian immigrants. I'm a first-generation college student. There's a lot of history there that is meaningful to me and that I sometimes tap into. Now, there's legitimate arguments that are made in social science against using such material, but as some feminist social scientists would argue, personal history can provide a valuable way of knowing. Now, given my working class upbringing, for example, I understand things about social stratification, let's say, that all the reading in the world can provide for me. Or I have a sense of the complicated and contradictory sets of attitudes that someone like my mother, who was a waitress all her life, I understand the contradictory sets of attitudes that she might have toward hard physical work. Now, speaking of using personal stories, I also find significant value in combining personal material with scholarship, each one benefiting the other. I'll give you an example. for another book of mine that I'll tell you about momentarily called The Mind at Work, I was reading the historian David Montgomery's extraordinary chapter called The Common Laborer, and this is in his book, The Fall of the House of Labor. And this chapter is about the huge influx of immigration in the mid to late 19th century and early 20th century that really fueled the rise of American industry. So as I was reading that chapter, I kept thinking of my grandfather, Tony Moralio, who immigrated from southern Italy to work in the Pennsylvania Railroad. And as vivid as Montgomery's writing is, my knowledge of Tony Moralio, the stories that I've heard and the photograph I have of him on my desk, that all brought a further depth of understanding to what Montgomery was telling me. But on the other hand, the context that the historian Montgomery provided, the macro view of social and economic forces, it brought Tony to kind of fuller life. He's not just a cluster of family stories anymore, but he's a man located in a time and a place, in a whole set of powerful social movements. So the table of labor statistics and the story of a life are quite different ways of representing the world, but I think they can also complement and enhance each other in powerful ways. Point number 7. Be skeptical of the big idea, the hot new theory. Now look, I want to make something very clear. I believe in gravity, and I'm not a climate change denier. I'm fine with theories. I like theories. But when it comes to explaining human behavior, I found it helpful to push the pause button and think things through. You know, we live in a TED Talk universe, a time of remarkable transformations that give rise to big predictions and grand theories. But sometimes, human variability, nuance, the particularity of our experience, that gets lost in the excitement of the new theory. And I guess I have a hesitation about abstractions, right? No matter how progressive the idea or the theory, I like to go slow. I like to actually be kind of conservative and cautious. I want to test the ideas against what I know and against my experience. If this idea is true, I ask myself, if this theory is true, how would it manifest itself? Let's say when people are at work in a factory, or when they're writing, or when they're raising children. I look for counter cases. I'm kind of a skeptic. I look for disconfirming evidence. What's going on with the outliers? Is there an alternative explanation for the evidence? Now, I might well end up buying the new idea, the big theory, but at least I feel like I'm doing it on more solid ground. Point number 8. Testing an idea with the community in your head. So another way I like to test out an idea, a theory, a new concept, either mine or somebody else's, is to imagine different people that I respect hearing or reading. Now let me be clear here. I'm not talking about all those little nattering voices in your head that tell you, that your writing stinks and that you're a dummy, right? Do you know those voices? Do you have those voices?
Yes.
I have those voices. We all have those voices. So I'm not talking about those voices. I don't want you listening to those voices. For me, the auditors that are interesting to me are the people I've known in my life who are smart and have a distinct point of view. Like the fellow who was my dissertation chairman, who was a first-class applied statistician and research methodologist, a very smart guy. I like to imagine, what's he think about this idea of God? But I also like to imagine my Uncle Joe, a guy who never finished high school and worked his whole life at General Motors. But he had a great ear for BS, right? And I like to think, what would he say about this idea? So I have these people in my mind who I test my ideas against and test other people's ideas. Some of these people in my mind are former students of mine who have gone on to become experts in mathematics education or testing and measurement. or issues of race and gender in education policy, what would they say? And how can I incorporate what they say in what I'm doing, or how can I argue back? Now here's the important caveat to this. So I really believe in this testing these ideas business, but I give you one warning. Don't do it too early in the process. Don't ever do it when you're still generating your ideas and your words, because it can paralyze you. But once you've got something together, once you've got something on the screen or on paper, then open the door and invite these imaginary readers into your world. Point number 9. Dealing with conflicting or contradictory information. This is an important one in social science. Sometimes our data comes out screwy because we made a mistake in our analysis and our calculations. Or the elements of someone's story don't add up because we missed something or we didn't ask the right questions. So then we go back to the drawing board and we think carefully about what we need to do to try and make things right. But realize that sometimes things are coming out confusing and contradictory because in fact they are confusing and contradictory. Things are rarely simple when it comes to studying human behavior. Your job then is to render as best as you can with numbers or with stories or with both that complicated, contradictory reality that you're uncovering. Don't try to smooth it over. Don't try to neatly fit a claim or into a seamless argument, and don't try and force a main effect. Because the real treasure might rest in the conflicting findings themselves, in the messy tension that you're uncovering. Okay, here's my last tip. This has to do with failure. Okay? And this one is hard learned and hard won, so I give it to you from my heart. Be ready to fail. Or at least get ready to think you're failing. If you're doing something worthwhile, if you're doing something that pushes on the edges of things even just a little bit, you're going to slam up against your limits. Not to mention all your insecurities and your demons. Every project of mine that has been worth anything has had me waking up in the middle of the night convinced that I couldn't do it. When I was getting close to the end of a book of mine called Possible Lives, which was a chronicle of my travels across the United States visiting good public school classrooms and trying to document what teachers were doing in them. When I was writing that book, I had this kind of dark night of the soul, and I had it more than once, believe me. I would be wide awake at 3 or 4 in the morning, convinced that I wasn't smart enough or skilled enough to know how to bring the book to a satisfying conclusion. And let me tell you the thoughts that went through my head. How could I let all those wonderful teachers down? I visited them, I spent that time with them, and now I wasn't going to be able to tell their stories. What made me think I could do this project in the first place? Oh Lord, how humiliating this is. My God, the public shame. Does this sound familiar? Anybody out there? You get those little thoughts in the middle of the night? No? You don't have them at all. You're so lucky. When this happens, just get out of bed. Get a drink of water. If you pray, then pray. If you take a pill, do that. Scribble some notes if that helps you. But realize this, the odds are that you're going to get through this. And maybe with a new insight. Maybe with a new way to frame the problem that's been vexing you. I keep a little voice recorder right by my bed just in case. And eventually, you're going to get to the place where you're able to say to those little furry-footed demons, oh, it's you guys again. And ask them then if they would like a drink or one of your pills. Invite them to curl up at the foot of the bed and then say a few words into your voice recorder that are going to get you out of that mess that you're in. So those are my 10 tips about writing, folks. And the last one I think might be the most important. So why don't you just take 30 seconds, stretch your arms, stand up, pat your partner on the back, and then I want to do a little reading for you that illustrate these 10 points. Good, stretch. Yeah, all right. Their jumping jacks are fine, anything you'd like. Okay, so what we're going to do now is I'm going to read to you 3 passages of stuff that I've written. The first one is just a paragraph long. The second one is a couple pages. And then the third is a bit longer. And you have these handouts, or you should. The first reading is the first one on the handout. It's just a single paragraph. Then the second reading, it's out of order, is the one that comes at the end. It's from the new preface to a book called The Mind at Work. And then the third one is right in the middle. It's the longest one, about transferring to the university. So the first little reading, just a paragraph, is out of this book, Back to School, that we're going to raffle off for you in a bit. And what this is it's a description of a large welding workshop at a technically oriented community college. And I want you to notice in it some of the points that I made in those 10 tips for writing. So one is just describing the obvious, the layout of this place. And then the second thing, the opening up of all the senses, because in here you'll not only get what you can see, but things you can smell and things you can hear. And then also you'll notice the use of the fragments of speech that I was talking about. So let's look at this first paragraph. It's the one that starts, the welding lab is a huge room. And by the way, I think we're going to be able to be done in plenty of time for lots of questions. So if you have questions about writing or the writing you're working on, we're going to have ample time to take those. The welding lab is a huge room, rows of workbenches down the middle and sheltered stalls along the walls. Welding equipment, gas tanks, the consoles for different electric welding processes, cutting machines, vices and grips, all this is spread throughout the room. Rows of pipes and conduits and vents are crisscrossed across the walls and overhead. Walk in the lab during class and you'll think you've entered Vulcan's workshop. 30 or more students are practicing their techniques. Sparks fly up from the workstations, and from inside the stalls, fiercely bright light pulses and dies. You'll need a mask to get close to the students. Everything is loud. The discordant symphony of welding pops and crackles, the continuous hammering as the novice welders knock slag off their welds or peen a weld to improve its ductility. Voices rise above the din. The instructor tells one guy and 3 others watching to look at your angle, man, look at your angle. And don't push the electrode, glide it. And even with the vents, the strong, acrid smell of electrical heat fills the air. This is where knowledge and skill are forged. The second reading, now this is the one that starts, so it's at the end of the packet. It starts when my mother Rosie came home. It's that one. And I'll tell you why I gave you that one. That one is from the very end of the preface, of the new preface that I wrote for the 10th anniversary edition of this book. This is the book called The Mind at Work. And what it is my attempt to capture the complicated thinking that goes into the doing of blue-collar and service work, the kind of work all my forebears did. Because I think in this high-tech age, we tend to forget the amount of intelligence involved in working in a busy restaurant or doing plumbing work or carpentry or working in a factory. And so this is an attempt to kind of recapture and present that. And what I'm going to read you is from the end of the new preface to the 10th anniversary edition of that book. And why I'm going to read it to you is, again, the sensory detail in it, what you can hear and see. Also because it's an example of that point I made about using a story and how a story has work to do. So I'm going to tell you this little story about my mother and myself when I was a kid and her tips, but then it makes a turn into a much broader point about work. And also in it, you'll see that blend that I was talking about of story and some simple descriptive statistics. So there's both story and number in it. So with that, let me read to you this little excerpt. When my mother Rosie came home after a long day waiting tables, she would spread out on the bed an old white kitchen towel turned gray from years of coins and dump her tips on it. As she told my father and me about her day, a fight with the cook or a regular's troubles at home, she would count and separate the coins. I had a weird fascination with that towel. Old and dirty, but the grime had a silver cast to it, the color of money. Quote, if it wasn't for the tips, she told me many years later, we would have never made it. There was a front and back counter in the restaurant where she worked, and she described working with her sidekick Ann, another career waitress, how they'd listen when they could slow down enough, quote, listen real hard for the sound of the tip and know if it was a dime, a quarter, a $50, or, quote, no sound at all. You either got stiffed or they left you $1. I don't remember many dollars on the bed. I take some coins out of my pocket, close my eyes, and give each a short toss onto the table. She was right. They have distinct sounds. A tink, a thunk, the sound of groceries, of rent, of school supplies, gas for the car. There's a direct line between those tips and me being able to sit here and write about my mother's work and my uncles and all the other people who make so much possible through their labor. There are about 2 million waitresses in the United States. Through a combination of physical and social skill and the ability to think on their feet, they support families and put kids through school, or pay for their own school, or help aging parents. They make restaurants function at the point of service. They contribute to the social fabric of the neighborhoods where they work. There are roughly 2 million home health care workers in our country, tending to those who are too sick to care for themselves. There are somewhere around 1.5 million plumbers, carpenters, and electricians daily clearing the flow of water, completing a circuit, building and repairing our shelter. The list continues outward and across the country. Ranch hands and farm workers, long-haul truckers and local drivers, firefighters and miners and welders, and the untold numbers of people who work in factories, canneries, and meat processing plants. Collectively, these men and women form a massive web of skill that makes our country function, that maintains and comforts and at times rescues us. They are so present, their mental and manual abilities so woven into our daily lives that their skills are taken for granted, at times slip out of sight. The mind at work documents their ability and pays homage to it. Okay. Now we're going to go to the longest piece, and this is the third piece of portraits from an urban community college. In this case, students who are going to be transferring to the university, or in some cases already have. Now let me tell you a little bit about this piece, just let me set the context. It takes place in a tutorial center, in a tutoring center at a local community college. And that's where the tutors work who are preparing to transfer, or in some cases already have transferred and come back to tutor at the center. I have a soft spot in my heart for tutoring centers. When I was just starting out, I tutored at a community college tutorial center. And then later, when I first came to UCLA, I ran our academic advancement program here. I ran their tutoring center. So I have a special place in my heart for tutoring centers. I think remarkable things happen in them. Let me tell you, you're going to hear a lot of voices in what I'm going to read, so I'll try and indicate those voices by saying quote before I read them. You're going to hear from a number of the tutors. And why did I give this to you in terms of the tips about writing? First of all, the detail, you'll notice. Second of all, again, the description of just the everyday. This tutoring center was nothing extraordinary. It was just a big room, but I try and give you a sense of where things are located in it. I use interviewing materials. I interviewed a lot of people, and I weave those interviews into the narrative, so I want you to see that. I also use overheard fragments of speech. And then finally, I use all of it, the whole story, to make a bigger point about access and diversity. So those are some of the kinds of things that I hope come across in this reading. So it starts with the wonder of it. Quote, the wonder of it is how William explains his fascination with astrophysics. Quote, what's out there, he asks softly but with emphasis. What's really out there? He knows he's got a ways to go, but he's getting closer with every semester. He's taking calculus now and chemistry too. Then next term it's more calculus and a physics course in the mechanisms of solids. Quote, this is where my heart is, he says. In a year, he plans to transfer to a university. We're sitting at an old table in the back of his community college's tutoring center where he works. He's in his mid-20s, a lightweight boxer's build, jeans, a hoodie, quietly articulate. The origins of his interest in science lie not in science, but in homelessness and his mother's desperation. There was a time, he explains, he was 6 or 7, when he, his younger brother, and mother lived in their car, then in an abandoned house. His mother worked 3 jobs, but she still couldn't make enough for rent. He would wake up in the middle of the night and find her crying, quote, turning to the sky and praying to God to help us, help us, help us. And I would wonder, he says, why is she looking to the sky? I know she says there's a God, but what's really out there? He started doing well in his science courses, middle school and high school. But according to him, the thing that, quote, in the end really topped it off was the Discovery Channel. William was amazed to learn about, quote, all these people looking at the stars and sending robots out into space. So I started doing research on it, and I found out that it all had to do with physics. It took years of working, being dissatisfied, taking one class, then another, changing jobs, learning the ins and outs of college, trying to balance work and school, trying the graveyard shift, starting with family, taking more classes, asking more questions. William finally got all the pieces together. Quote, I kind of had to discover everything on my own, but now I'm not going to let anything stop me. The Tutoring Center is one large room with computer stations along 2 walls. There are also 5 round tables closer to us with computers on them. 2 old couches sit side by side close to the entrance, and other tables, like the one William and I share, and chairs are spread around the room, some separated from others with movable partitions. A lot goes on here. In addition to tutoring, the center hosts workshops on everything from using the computer to writing the college admissions essay. A sizable number of students on this campus do not own a computer or they lack internet access, so they come here to do assignments. And some students have grown attached to the center and stop in for quick advice on everything from course selection to problems with home life. There's a homey feel to the place. While I was interviewing William, an older woman was chatting with one of the tutors, urging her to get her flu shot. And a guy from the culinary program, white coat and chef's hat, came in bringing a tray of pastries. In front of us, a tutor is helping a woman narrow down her topic for a psychology paper. The woman says, quote, I'm trying to figure out how people become more tolerant. Over to our left, another tutor is sitting alongside a big man in a muscle t-shirt. She says, quote, give us some insight as to why you're using this quotation. And he nods and leans into the keyboard. And alongside them, another tutor is encouraging a diminutive young woman. He cradles the side of his head in his hand, looking at her sideways. He says, quote, you do have some second language writing issues, but your vocabulary is great. Then he says, don't let the frustration beat you. You'll get this. I started coming to the Tutoring Center because the remedial classes I was observing required students to complete some online assignments there. I was impressed with the tutors, with their intelligence and camaraderie, and with their commitment to the work. They talked about, quote, making a difference, about wanting to do more, about feeling, quote, overwhelming gratitude for the opportunity to be so involved in other people's lives. The tutors were either preparing to transfer to a university or had already done so and kept their job at the center. I got to know them pretty well. And once my other work was completed, I would increasingly stay late and talk to them. Let's meet some of them. Antonio did well in high school. He was the editor of his school's newspaper, and he went straight to college but had to quit because of illness. He picked up again at a community college in another city, then came here and transferred last year to a local private university as an English major. He loves to talk about books and writing, about the way literature becomes part of you, the characters and plots becoming, quote, engraved in you. He's reading the detective fiction writer Raymond Chandler, and he laughs as he explains how he'll be walking down the street and, quote, the next thing I know, I'm describing what I'm doing in that distinct Philip Marlowe voice that Chandler was known for. Larry is the tutor who had his head in his hand and was encouraging that young woman who wasn't a native speaker of English. He's in his mid-30s, an ex-Marine who was in and out of prison after his discharge, got his life together at this college, and is now a double major at one of the state universities, linguistics and conflict resolution. He says in amazement how much he loves what he's doing. Amazed because he used to hate, just hated high school. He's taken an African studies course, a course in the sociology of the family, labor studies, and a course in the psychology of peace building, taught by a former United Nations negotiator. He tells me about his project, designing a charter school in the occupied territory for Arab and Israeli children. Many years ago, I worked in a tutoring center at another community college and later went on to direct one at UCLA, so I have a soft spot for them, for the very idea of them. A common space where students come to learn things in a more personal way, to test their own understanding of the material, to try out ideas, to practice a developing skill with the guidance of more skillful others. There's a lot to say about the center we've been visiting, the students it serves, the dedication of its tutors. But one thing that particularly strikes me is how frequently the current tutors were once receiving services here themselves. The same is true for the fellow who now manages the center. He's a graduate student in education at a nearby state university, but he began his post-secondary career at this campus after an injury made it impossible to continue in the meat processing industry. He placed into low-level math, pre-algebra, and equally low in English. He had a lot of remedial coursework in front of him. But he came to the center. He slowly made his way up the remedial ladder. He took his general education requirements. He transferred. He got his BA. He entered graduate school. And he came back here to tutor and then to help run the place. Within the little institutional niche of the tutoring center there is both upward mobility and reciprocity, whereby members of this miniature community over time have the possibility to sit on both sides of the table. Maybe that's one reason they seem to have such understanding of the students they work with. Quote, "It's a different world if you go straight from high school to college," a tutor named Cassandra told me. I was that student sitting across from me. Cassandra is in her late 20s, has a bright, round face, brown, wavy hair that fans across her shoulders. Her eyes hold yours when she talks. Students come to the center requesting her. She's a skillful tutor, working with a wide range of students, from those needing help developing an essay to those who are just learning English and are struggling with their textbooks. If you watched her at work or met her, she sticks her hand straight out to shake yours with a firm grip. If you watched her, you'd be as surprised as I was to hear her story. She moves through the center with assurance. She's planning to get a graduate degree in psychology. She is passionate and articulate about her work and has a sensibility forged from her own difficult experience. She lays out the problems some of her students have: poor academic preparation, little money, prison records, tumultuous personal lives. But, quote, "I would hate for them to just wither away without realizing their full potential, to know what they're worth, how smart they really can be." Like most of the tutors here, Cassandra's path to college was neither linear nor certain. She did enter college right after high school and took a number of classes, but she felt out of place and inadequate and eventually quit. For some time, it had been hard for her to concentrate on school. Her mother was chronically ill, and her father was distant and demeaning. Quote, "I was always worried." I have known so many students like Cassandra, and in fact, I in some ways was one myself. She never got into big trouble, but she drifted through her classes undistinguished. Things were unstable at home, and she was consumed with worry and disengaged at school. A disengagement that some teachers took to be stubbornness or worse. Several teachers did try to intervene in a way that might have been well-intentioned, telling her that she'd better get focused or, quote, she wasn't going to amount to anything. But that kind of talk only wounded her all the more. The damage of tough love. She was caught in an awful spiral of insecurity and retreat, which was interpreted as disdain, which led to Cassandra's further marginalization. For much of her academic life, Cassandra felt like an outcast, ignored, not very bright, going nowhere. She worked since she was 16, through high school and through and after her first stint in college, but those jobs were increasingly unrewarding. I was just lost, she says. Then one day, a few years back, a friend of hers invited her along to a basic skills math class at her college so that they could hang out afterward. It was an utterly random act. Sitting in the math class, Cassandra began to think about school, how long it had been, how this didn't feel so bad. The next term, she signed up for a speech class, quote, just for my own growth. I had no intention of going full-time or transferring. Then next term, one more class, a philosophy class. Then one more term, one more class. Then 1 year after that serendipitous visit to math, she enrolled in an English composition class that, quote, totally changed everything for me. The professor wasn't easy. He challenged students, make them defend what they wrote or said. But according to Cassandra, there was something about the way he looked at you while he was challenging you. Quote, you knew he meant well. This professor called on the reluctant Cassandra, spoke to her in the hall about her papers. He asked her opinion about things. He asked what she wanted to do with her life. Quote, I never had a teacher talk to me like that. He was poking at my brain. Wow, I thought, I'm not dumb. While she was taking the professor's course, Cassandra was coming to the Tutoring Center, working regularly with 2 tutors. Toward the end of the term, one of them laid down his pencil, put his hand on the table, and he said flatly, quote, one of these days, you're going to be sitting here tutoring somebody else. This was one more in a string of light bulb moments Cassandra was having at college. And she began to think, quote, I have to do this. I'm going to transfer. One of the major goals of public and private initiatives aimed at the community college is to increase the rate of transfer to a 4-year college or university. There are just over 1,200 community colleges in the United States, and depending on their location and the demographics of the high schools and neighborhoods that feed into them, they have various levels of success in fulfilling their transfer mission. Community colleges can provide services and programs to support transfer, and one strategy that helps is to create, quote, learning communities, or, quote, first-year experience programs, or programs built around so-called at-risk populations. Programs that create cohorts of students who take classes and receive services together. In an informal way, the Tutoring Center functions as such a program. The management model encourages cooperation and shared responsibility among the tutors, and I frequently saw tutors conducting workshops together, sharing students, covering for each other. The tutors use their minds collectively in the service of others, creating in the process an intellectual community among themselves. Larry, one of the tutors we met earlier, Larry told me he considers the people in the center his family. There are a lot of roads leading to a college degree, from the one straight out of high school to the retiree going back to school to complete a journey that was interrupted decades before. And there are many, many roads that lead to an intellectual pursuit, to physics, or literature, or psychology, or the study of conflict and peace. The more varied the pathways to degrees and to intellectual pursuits, the more personal histories, the more points of view, the richer we are for it. Cassandra's experience in school and her work as a tutor will shape her study of the way people learn. Larry's life on the streets and in prison and the particular way he survived it all gives him a certain understanding of violence and reconciliation. And William's fascination with astrophysics has a heartbeat to it. Even if these tutors end up asking the same kinds of questions that are asked by others in their university courses, they will ask them in a different way. Okay, so those are the readings, and that I hope illustrate some of the points I made when I was talking about writing. So what we'd like to do now would be to open up to questions. And David, how much time do we have? How are we doing?
We have 30 minutes.
We have 30 minutes, people. So if you have questions about writing, I'll try and answer them. Anybody? No questions? Okay, we'll go drink mimosas then, right? No? Questions? Don't be shy. Oh, I'm so excited.
My question, I'm not sure if this relates, but I read a lot of, like, I read with a lot of educational literature, and it's, has a lot of qualitative and quantitative data. It's very observational, and very prevalent when it comes to the intersections between education and policy. But what I do notice is that when I'm looking at actual educational policy, it doesn't seem to be translating or saturating into actual educational policy as quickly. Do you feel like that's because of how things are being written? Because I notice, like, when I read these papers, like, they're usually written in this very academic, lofty way, and then we talk to, like, people in administration, for example, they have no idea what a lot of those terms or these, educational literature observations mean, and it's not translating perhaps.
Right. So she's raising this really important question that a lot of people are wrestling with right now, and it's basically the problem that you have all this stuff that's written in education and educational scholarship, and for that fact, not just in education, but in political science and sociology and public health and other areas that have direct relevance to education, and yet that doesn't seem to make its way into public policy, or often it doesn't. And it doesn't often make its way into a more public kind of discourse. Am I getting your question right? And she was just asking, do I have any thoughts as to why that is? And you said one of the reasons. I think one of the reasons is that you all know this. If you pick up an academic journal, they're often not written in the most accessible of ways, right? They're full of jargon or specialized terminology. If they're quantitative, they're written in a way that's kind of hard for the layman to make sense out of the quantitative data. If they're qualitative, as the sort of stuff I was reading, sometimes the big idea, the main point, kind of gets lost in the story. So one part of the problem is in the literature itself, the research itself. And that's why there's a movement afoot within the research community to try and figure out how to at least do some work that is more directly translatable and immediately accessible to broader readerships. I mean, that's part of what I've tried to do with my stuff. So that's one thing. The second thing is, this is a hard thing to swallow, but certain areas just are not as important in journalism as others. So when the reporters who are on the education beat, those that's not a high status assignment. So if you're covering the Pentagon, if you're covering national politics, that's big status. Education is a lower status thing, and people tend to cycle through it. So you don't often have a chance for individual journalists to build a real body of expertise and knowledge. You know what I mean? So that's a second problem. That's a problem on the media side. That there's just not a lot of people that are super informed about issues of education. So there's a problem there as well. And the third thing has to do with just political will, right? And the tenor of the times. I mean, I don't have to tell you that we're living at a time where it's really hard to get some of these ideas to have any uplift in either state or national legislators, because the commitment and the political will is not there. So even if the ideas are really well shaped and well translated, and even if they do get coverage, it doesn't necessarily mean they're going to make it through the legislative process. Which is why, again, some large organizations like the American Educational Research Association, they actually have lobbyists in DC, that try to get some of this stuff at least in front of staffers. So I think it's a combination of all that stuff and more, but it's a huge question that you're raising, and it's certainly one that's on the mind of a lot of people. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I wanted to kind of take it back to these 10 pieces of tips that you had for us, particularly with number 8. I was hoping that you could expand on like letting things be kind of complex.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. So he asks a nice question. It has to do with tip number 8, which is something like, if something's complex, it might be because it is complex, and what to do about that, right?
It's like, where's the center of gravity in those types of situations?
Yeah.
Particularly for the qualitative data that you might be seeking out.
Yeah. So the point I was trying to make there is human behavior and human institutions is very, very complex. I mean, if you just think about it, just look at our own lives. None of us do things simply for one reason or one motive. Usually anything we do, just in our day-to-day interactions, is driven by multiple motives, multiple things in our background, the context that we're in. I mean, human behavior, human institutions, human activity is complicated. Okay. So along comes social scientists, right? And social scientists are trying to make sense out of things. We're trying to break things down analytically. And we do that with a whole range of methodologies, both statistical, quantitative kinds of methodologies and qualitative methodologies. And those are powerful tools. I mean, they've been developed over centuries. And they certainly often yield insights and various kinds of truths. And sometimes we do get a kind of a clear answer about something, right? Relatively clear answer. But sometimes what happens, and this has certainly happened to me in my research, you get, if you're doing qualitative stuff, let's say you're surveying a group of people, you get this person saying this, and this person saying that, a third person saying this, and oh my God, their opinions about an issue, whether it's about, charter schools or needle exchange programs or whatever. You get this huge, you might get a huge range of responses. Well, your inclination as a social scientist is to try and find some underlying effect, some kind of singular explanation. You're trying to come up with, this is the reason, or these are the two reasons why something is the case. But oftentimes that's not it. That it's coming back messy because it is messy. Because people, for example, around questions like needle exchange programs might have a huge range of opinions, depending on their own exposure within their families to addiction, depending on where they live, depending on their religious and political affiliations, right? So the question I think you're asking me, I think you used an interesting phrase. You said, where's the center of gravity, or how do you find the center, right? In other words, how do you even begin to address that? Yeah. Here's what I believe in, I think is one way to go, is to lay your cards on the table, is to be direct and honest as a researcher with your readers, with your audience, and say, what is so interesting, dear reader, about these results is how contradictory they are, or how across the board they are, or how varied they are. In other words, rather than trying to put them all in a neat box, is to actually state the case directly to the reader about the complexity. And then see if you can start to tease it out. See if you can then start to say, given this complexity, here are 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 things I think might be going on. So my bias is to just go right into the heart of the problem itself, lay it on the table, and then try and tease out what you can tease out. Yeah, it's a good question, and it's a hell of a writing challenge, you know. So that's why I say I think the best thing to do is to just honestly lay it out. Good questions. Yeah, some more people. Yeah.
So the starting role and the way we read it are just so beautiful and inspiring, and really appreciate. So I was wondering, as we really got into the obvious, the detail, the real speeches, and the personal stories of others, has there been, during that process, has there been any moments of frustration that you felt kind of overwhelmed by what you've seen, what you've heard, and how you thought about it? So then how did you handle that?
Okay, and I couldn't hear them. My hearing's crummy, so I heard the last half, or the first half. David, can you?
I heard the last.
So if I heard the first half and you heard the last half, we can make this work.
If I recall correctly, she was saying how your writing was really good.
Yeah, I got that part. I didn't miss that. No, bless your heart for that. Right.
And she was saying something along the lines of like feeling overwhelmed by the amount of data and like what you're experiencing.
That's what I thought. Right.
Then how did you handle that?
Yeah, and I think especially you were talking about just like when I was talking about recording the everyday and all that, and how it could just be finally so much, right? Yeah. So good, I thought that was it. So she is raising the big vexation. She's raising the big thing that drives people who do this kind of work, drives us crazy. And that is that, you know, if you spend, gee whiz, I mean, like for this back to school book that you're gonna get, I spent, God, I guess about a year and a half at this community college. So I ended up with notebook after notebook after notebook after notebook of stuff. And you're right, the question is, how do you even start to get a handle on that to be able to write about it, right? So there are courses that will actually help you learn how to do this. For example, in our Graduate School of Education here, we have a 3-quarter series of courses that do just that help you learn how to, you know, make your way through that stuff and decide what's important, and then code it in a way that enables you to find themes and topics and handle it. But in a nutshell, what I can tell you is I will sit with, let's say, a full notebook worth of stuff. That welding, that description of the welding room, for example. I spent a lot of time in that welding class. So I had a whole thick notebook just about that welding workshop. So what I did was I would go through that notebook page, I would read the whole thing through. And then I would read it through again. And as I read it through again, and I'm marking it up, and I have highlighters and different kinds of things. This is very old school. People do this all on computers now, but I'm back in the 18th century somewhere. So that second time through, things start to jump out. For example, I notice how often, this is one little thing, but I'll notice how often the instructors in there are doing that kind of thing you heard them doing, where they're standing right next to, they've got their masks on, and they're standing right next to those students, and they're hollering at them, telling them what to do, or in some cases actually taking their arm and moving it. So I start to notice that, geez, there's a lot of really very close work that's done in instruction. So suddenly now I've got a theme that I've noticed, right? So I start looking for more examples of that, all right? So then let's say as I'm reading through, I also notice that a lot of that kind of stuff happens between students or among students. So there's not only the instructor doing that stuff, but I'm starting to notice that students are doing it. So they're kind of looking over at the guy at the next booth, right, or the next workstation. So now this takes time, of course, but you see what I mean about what happens is that as you go through this, at first, overwhelming amount of stuff, you begin to see these things, these themes. We call them themes in qualitative research, right? These themes start to emerge. And then those might lead you to make some higher level kind of judgment or statement about the way learning a trade like welding happens, right? So does that help? Yeah. But you are right. I mean, trust me, sister. The first impulse when I'm sitting with one of those books is like, oh my God, right? It's massive. It's just so much stuff, right? Good question. Some more questions? Okay, we got time. So, yeah.
You were saying that right now that you have like a whole bunch of work for the welding part. And I noticed throughout the text it was very concise and like beautifully written. How are you able to like take out what is necessary about all the sensory items and parts like that? Like how are you able to say like, okay, this is what I need for this part, instead of writing like a whole entire page and then keeping that in there?
So you're asking me a question about the craft of it, right? Yeah, how do I select, tell me if I'm getting this right, how do I select the kind of detail that I'm going to use? Is that it? I want to make sure I'm getting it right. Yeah. See, they don't want me to move out from behind this damn podium because of the camera, so I can't walk over toward you to make sure I'm hearing you. Did I get it?
Yeah.
Okay. So she's asking a really important writerly question here. And I think all writers face this, fiction writers as well as writers who do the kind of writing I do. Let's go back to that notebook example. Like if I'm spending days and days and days in that welding workshop, you're right, I'm going to have tons of different details, right? So what helps me determine which detail to use is the driving point that I want to make. So what's the big idea I want to get across? Do you remember when I was reading those tips on rating, I said something about details are important, but details have to lead to an idea or build to an idea, or that there's a relationship between the details and the idea. And so part of what helps me make the decision about which details to use is what point I want to make. Now, in that one little paragraph that I gave you, there's really no big point there other than just to give you that description of the welding shop. But that description is in a larger passage that I didn't give you, where I'm making some kind of point about the way occupational education is structured and that. So it was hard to see in just that paragraph what the point might be. But let's take the thing about my mother, counting the tips and stuff, right? So in there, the details that I'm selecting are all going to be details that are in some way going to have to do with, in the first part of the story, details that have to do in some way with her making a living and how fundamentally important those tips were to just putting groceries in the refrigerator and putting gas in the car. And so the details that I'm looking for are going to be that sort of thing. There might be other really compelling details that I could tell you about my mother, but I'm leaving them out of that section because it's really important for me to kind of get that idea there. So the idea is going to drive the details that you use. It's a really good question. I had an editor, in fact, in one of my first books, I had a passage, a couple paragraphs in there that I just loved. I loved them. I was like, great writing. I love this. And she made me take it out because it wasn't relevant to the point that I was making in that section. Yeah. It's a good question. Way in the back. Yeah.
I was wondering, you seem to obviously have a very natural knack for writing. You know that you always want to be a writer. If not, or if so.
Okay. Yeah, so thank you for that compliment, by the way. She said I seem to have a knack for this or something, and did I always know that I wanted to do it? And how did I come to that, I think? Was that right? Yeah. So the fact is I'm a really late bloomer. I didn't do hardly any writing all the time I was growing up. I was just a sort of screw-off in school. And it was a senior high school English teacher who changed my life and was the guy that started talking to me about going to college. I hadn't even thought about that, you know. So it wasn't until my senior year in high school that I even began to pay attention to writing, and that was because he assigned so much of it. It was over the next 5-6 years that I began to get more and more invested in it, I think. Let me see if this makes sense. I think I began to see, and I couldn't have articulated it this way when I was 21 or 22 or 23, but I think I began to see that writing allowed me to do something that I wasn't able to do in other parts of my life or with other parts of my life. And so I began to play around with it. I tried to write poetry, and the poetry was lousy, but I still enjoyed doing it. And I learned from doing it. And then it's just one thing led to another, and I kept working at it. But I am by no means a natural. What you're seeing here is the result of, you know, decades worth of hard work. So take that as, this is sincere advice. If writing is difficult for you, just you keep at it. You keep at it. It will take whatever you give it, and I promise you that if you keep at it, you will get better at it. Because I did not start off knowing how to do it at all. So, yeah, thanks. How are we on time?
5 minutes.
5 minutes. We got time for another question at least. Yeah.
She had her hand up for like 6 questions. I can go after her.
Oh man, I'm sorry. I apologize.
So this is kind of like going into my research, where gender bias comes in and all that. So I wanted to ask how you maintain, because you said in one of your tips to share personal stories and material and thoughts. How would I still maintain like my ethos in my writing while presenting these personal stories and thoughts that may include bias?
Yeah. Your personal stories and thoughts that may
Include bias.
your own. You mean your own bias?
Yes.
Yeah. So so it's a good question. If you do use personal material, what can you do? Let's see. What can you do to make sure that the story maybe isn't infused with various kinds of biases or whatever of your own? Is that am I getting it right?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, first of all, of course, any story you tell is going to be your story. So it's going to have you in it. It's going to have your beliefs and your background and your heart and your soul in it. So it may well have some kinds of strong beliefs and that, and that's okay. But I think what I do often, well, not often, always, is I have other people then read, like that thing about my mother, right? I'll have other people read that and ask them what they're getting from it, and ask them, to kind of just check me, really. So my technique is to have other readers that I really trust, who can read my stuff, and especially if I'm starting to tell something personal and something close to me, and check me on it, and say, hey, you know what, this kind of goes over the line here, or you need to do more explaining here, or is maybe something else going on here you're not articulating. So that's my suggestion, is to have some trusted readers. By the way, people, I can't recommend that strongly enough. Find your good readers. Those people who you meet in classes or you have as friends, who you can show your stuff to and will give you good and honest feedback, not try to hijack it. You don't want somebody who's going to take your thing and say, oh man, this is the way I would do it. No. You want them to read it for what you're trying to do, but give you honest feedback on it. That is one of the most powerful things you can do as a writer. So do we have time for one more? Okay. The gentleman, yeah.
How do we create more value in either matters that relate to education and or social sciences that are not necessarily tied to numeric value or monetary gain or economics, and basically shy away from the capitalistic industrial complex, to help society understand the quality of our work, basically, and to change the way we operate as a humanity. I think that, as you mentioned, the work that we do is complex, but it seems as if academia is shying away from this work to promote things that help us gain from a money standpoint, right? And I'm trying to figure out how we can insert all of these great qualities to the work we do so that society actually values this work.
So that's a beauty of a question to end on, because it's the values question, really, that you're asking. Did everybody hear that?
I didn't understand it.
Okay. So I think what he's asking is, how can we do work that doesn't just advance a kind of economic agenda, that doesn't just advance the status quo, that doesn't just advance current institutional structures, but that also is infused in some way with more humane or progressive, humanistic, spiritual even, values and motives. Am I getting close or
You said it
no?
beautifully, thank you.
Did I do it?
Yeah, perfect.
Oh, okay, great, thank you.
You're the doctor.
The doctor is in, yes, right. That's such a wonderful question. And I don't have an easy answer for it, but I have a couple thoughts. Let me offer them to you. One is, in the work you do, you try to represent that fuller reality. It's going to be probably close to impossible to not in some way address, let's say, the economic side of things. I mean, I got to tell you, as somebody who, I'm happy for the economic benefits that I have gotten from the work I've done, because, I know what it's like to have your furniture repossessed and to be worrying about having a roof over your head. So I don't want to poo-poo that. But I think what we can do is we can say, that's important. We understand that's important. But look at what else there is that we're not talking about. And I think that's hugely important, especially right now today in school reform, and all the talk about school reform and the purpose of schools and the purpose of the university is all we hear. This is why I think you're asking the question. All we hear is the economic justification. And what the way I would like to phrase it is, of course we're in school and we're doing all we're doing for economic reasons, but we're also doing them for ethical reasons and moral reasons and spiritual reasons. And why aren't we talking about these things? Because those are powerful motivators as well. And if you look back at the history of the United States, those other motives have often been in our best articulated statements about the purpose of schooling. So in some ways, you're asking us to go, in my writing, I ask us to go back and look at these fuller purposes of schooling that have been articulated by very wise people in our past and to front load them again. So that's kind of my angle on it. And this Why School book, that the appendix, that the writing tips comes out of, check it out at the library, because there's some essays in the beginning of it that deal exactly with what you're talking about. Okay, yeah. All right, we did it, David. Yo!